Okay, Erev Tov. We're studying Vayakhel Pekudei together, even though they're separate this year. This will cover us for the next 2 weeks. And it's a lovely essay about Bezalel's leadership, a close reading of an Agadah in Masechet Brachot, which was a little familiar to me, but for sure her insights deepened the thought about it and the what's going on in how the Chachamim are trying to look at Bezalel and what his leadership persona could teach us about this moment in the development of Am Yisrael. So let me share my screen. If you're lucky, you can hear some piano in the background. Zoom might be cutting it out, but we have piano practice happening in the house right now. So this is Bezalel's leadership, an additional step in leaving Egypt. Bezalel is a key character in our Parshiot. In Tractate Brachot 55a, there's a short sugya that deals with Bezalel ben Uri, one of the chief artisans building the Mishkan. This sugya raises varied perceptions regarding the qualities necessary for leadership and the qualifications of a leader. In the following lines, I will suggest that this discussion of the leadership model that Bezalel presents, a discussion found at the end of the book of Exodus, is an added step in the distancing from Egypt, a step from a reality in which Moshe, the man of God, is the leader, towards the possibility of human leadership of a different kind. She's not going to delve fully into the question of why the Chachamim build a leadership model out of Bezalel. We're going to have to think about that as we read, and maybe we'll spend a couple minutes on it at the end. At first glance, the sugya has a three-tiered structure, according to which Bezalel is a community leader, Parnas, a leader who has three different qualities. First, he is chosen by God. We start in with this passage in Brachot 55a. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shlosha dvarim machriz alehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba'atzmo. There's three things that God announces or decrees. God's self doesn't leave to other intermediaries, but God announces God's own self. Ve'eluhen, here they are. Ra'av v'sova, a famine, plenty, uparnas tov, and a good parnas, a good leader or sustainer, patron of some kind. We get proof text for the other two, not germane to our discussion right now. And then the third one, parnas tov. How do we know that God's very own self, decrees or announces or assigns the good leaders? As it's written, God said to Moshe, look, or here, I have called by name Bezalel, meaning God designated Bezalel, God's self. Not only was he chosen by God, but he was also chosen by the people. The Gemara goes on to quote Rabbi Yitzchak, Ein ma'amidin parnas al hatzibur, ela im kein nimlachim b'tzibur. We're going to get into the proof text for that, or the midrashic background for that statement a little bit later. We don't appoint a leader over the community unless we consult with the community. Nothing about us without us is how we say it nowadays for inclusive processes of policy making. Nothing about us without us. So you can't appoint a parnas over the congregation unless you consult with the congregation. So part number one, God declares a leader, God's self. Part number two, there is a process of consultation with the subjects or the constituency of that leader. And finally, he's described as wise. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yonatan, Bezalel al shem chochmato nikra. He was called Bezalel on account of his wisdom. And when she does her second read through, she'll include the background again, the midrashic underpinnings for this claim. But rereading the sugya that we have before us reveals two disputes dealing with the legitimacy of Bezalel's leadership. Disputes that raise two questions about the validity and merit of his position. Okay, so having said that, we have sort of three qualities without kind of relating between them, chosen by God, also chosen by the people, and described as wise. Now we're going to delve a little further and say, but actually, do all of those kind of cohere and complement each other, or do they indicate some kind of inherent tensions? And she wants to suggest that they indicate some kind of inherent tension, disputes dealing with the legitimacy of Bezalel's leadership that raise two questions about the validity and merit of his position. First comes the question of whether he was chosen by God or chosen by the people, right? We said chosen by God, and then we said consulting with the people, but sort of which is it? Where does his authority and his appointment stem from? And secondly comes the question of how his wisdom is defined and measured. Okay, having said he's called Bezalel because he's wise, but what's the nature of that wisdom? Is it measured by its force of prophecy? In other words, by the degree to which he sticks to a premeditated, known divine plan? Is he wise because he intuits or understands God's wishes? Or is it actually measured by its creativity and its ability to suggest change vis-a-vis a plan that is presented before Bezalel? In this case, a plan presented to him by Moshe. We don't, until we see the Midrash developing that question of his wisdom, we don't understand what she means by this, but we'll see it later. So what is the nature of his wisdom? First question. Who elected Bezalel, or how does one locate a communal leader that is worthy of his public position? In his dictionary, Ben Yehuda defines the word parnas as follows: an agent, one who feeds and provides. He actually uses the word administrator as a non-Hebrew defining word, and thus emphasizes the significance of giving, administering, that is embedded in the word. Right? This is someone who's responsible for providing for the needs of people, overseeing systems that ensure that people are well taken care of. Moreover, Ben Yehuda adds another realm of meaning and explains that a parnas is also a leader, the head of the community, manager, gabbai. Bezalel, who is introduced in our parashah before the people, is represented in the literature of the sages as the paragon of a parnas. Now we're going to make our way back through, and again, reminding ourselves that if you didn't read the Gemara and you just read the Chumash, you would say that Bezalel is an architect or a project manager, maybe a master craftsperson or artisan, but the idea of him particularly being a paragon of a leader is not obvious, or certainly doesn't seem to be what the text focuses on. Yes, to be chosen to be the architect or project manager for God's home, you imagine you have to be something besides for just good at your craft, but that's all really the Torah focuses on, and Chachamim are developing this further. So now we're going to go back through our three qualities. So Rabbi Yochanan says again, three things that God decrees God's self, and one of them is the Parnas Tov, as it says, "Behold, I've called Bezalel by name." One can understand the financial or administrator role attributed to Bezalel through the word Parnas in light of some other biblical passages that are in close proximity to the election of Bezalel. She doesn't attribute this interpretation. This seems to be her own. Why? She's asking the question here. Why describe Bezalel as a Parnas? We've really only seen him as a master craftsperson. So she says, if you look at the fact, and here I didn't open up the Psukim, but let's do that now. A second. Okay, the first time we meet Bezalel, not even in our Parashah, but in this past week's Parashah. When God says the first time, Re'e karati b'shem Bezalel ben Uri ben Chor l'matei Yehuda, that was back in this past week's Parashah. Hold on. Yes, that's true. In this past week's Parashah, Kitisa. In close proximity to that is the beginning of the Parsha. Not very close proximity, but okay, not that many verses away. Earlier in the previous chapter is the census, which is made through the half shekel payment. And this is a connection that she wants to develop. Okay, in light of some other passages that are in close proximity. So in 31:1-3, we have God said to Moshe, this is what the Gemara is quoting from. I've singled out by name Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur, endowed him with a divine spirit, knowledge in every kind of craft. This election, meaning this choice of Betzalel, is in close proximity to demanding the collection of the half shekel tax for the Mishkan. In other words, it seems that the narrator of this midrash does not understand the choice of Betzalel only on the basis of his knowledge, wisdom, and abilities, as one might assume from a direct reading of the verses. Rather, he connects this choice of Betzalel to what was described earlier in the verses, the commandment on collecting half a shekel, and possibly also the collection of the truma, the priestly gift, towards the general building of the Mishkan. This is, I think, her interpretation of how does the expansion of Betzalel's role in rabbinic literature, where does it come from? She says, well, if you look, 15 psukim earlier, we have the command to collect the half shekel. And if God is shortly thereafter saying, look, I've assigned Betzalel to oversee this whole thing, maybe Betzalel is also somehow involved in collecting the half shekel. And there, in that case, he has other financial responsibilities. He has a broader management role, and he may be interacting with all kinds of people, not just the other craftspeople. And so he's a leader in a broader sense. Rabbi Yochanan's statement is not preoccupied with the definition of Betzalel as a community leader, Parnas, but rather in the manner in which he was selected, right? He's not, the details of his role are not so important to Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan wants to understand, how did he get to be this person? Rabbi Yochanan is presented as learning from the verses God's direct involvement in the selection of Parnasim in general. Right? So we're making the assumption that Betzalel is a Parnas, and we're saying from the fact that God chose him explicitly that this shows that God chooses leaders. Right after his statement, we find another. Now we're reviewing our second statement. Rabbi Yitzchak, who said, we only set up a Parnas over the congregation if we consult with the congregation. In the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, it is claimed that a communal leader must be voted by the community. He too proves his statement upon the case of Betzalel. And now we get the deeper, the proof that wasn't included in our first read through. And here it is. God said to Moshe, we'll read it in the English. God said to Moshe, Moshe, do you consider Betzalel suitable? Moshe said to God, Sovereign of the universe, if you think he is suitable, all the more so I must. Language is im lefanecha hagun, lefanai lo kol shekain. How much the more so? I would definitely think so. God, if you're choosing him, how could I disagree? Then for sure I would agree. God said to Moshe, even so, go and say to them, lechem or lahem, you got to go tell this to Bnei Yisrael. Even though you agree and I agree, we need their input. Moshe went and said to Yisrael, just like God did to him, he now does to them, Haguna lechem Betzalel, do you consider Betzalel suitable? They replied, if the Blessed Holy One and you consider him suitable, all the more so we must. The sages, so we have this, sense that from the fact that God said to Moshe, Re'u kara Hashem, in the original psukim, sorry, Re'e karati v'shem Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur. See, look, I have called him, but God is sort of telling Moshe this. Somehow we're imagining that God is inviting Moshe's input, and then guess when we have Re'u, when Moshe then says to Bnei Israel, Re'u kara Hashem b'shem, look, God has called. Moshe is sort of telling them, maybe look sort of means look and evaluate. You take a look and see, what do you think about this designation? James writes, not exactly a glowing recommendation, meaning from the fact that they say, well, if you think so, then it must be good. They're not saying anything independently. Yes, I'll mention that Rav Kook Rav Kook has a commentary on Agadah on a couple of the Masechtot of the Gemara, and one of them is Masechet Brachot, where this Agadah appears, called Ein Ayah. And he has a really lovely take on this, which addresses, James, your point a little bit. It's a midrashic reading of the midrash, but he suggests that there are sort of three planes on which the qualities of a person can be discerned. There are the things, that are really just in the heart, that only God knows, a person's inner thoughts, that just sort of are only discernible to God. Then there is their kind of knowledge and wisdom, which can actually only be really assessed by other wise leaders, and that even people can't, like, people can't, the common person can't actually apprehend or comprehend, but smart people can tell if a person like this, if a person is really smart. Um, and then the third is kind of the slightly more aesthetic qualities of a leader, even just appearance, manner of presentation, charisma, those kinds of things. And those are the things that sort of appeal to the masses or are, and are assessed by the masses. And so what Rav Kook says is, Bezalel had all three. And what was going on was God asked Moshe, what do you think? And Moshe says, look, I don't know about those inner qualities, but God, if, I know that he's good on the knowledge front, what I can see as a fellow Talmid Chacham or whatever, however we imagine Moshe, but I can't assess the inner qualities. But God, if you think he's good, meaning you're signing off on the innermost qualities, then for sure me, because I can only assess the second tier qualities. And then God says, fine. So we've got quality levels 1 and 2 confirmed, but we can't really do this without asking the people about level 3. And so Moshe goes to the people and says, what do you think? And the implication of their statement is, well, we're thrilled with his charisma and his affect and his manner and his delivery and all of that. But we can't assess numbers, the innermost and the, elite assessment. But if he's good for you, Moshe, and you're saying, Moshe, that he's good for God, then, well, he checks our box also. So that's a way of actually filling Bezalel, so to speak, with real qualities that the plain sense of the story doesn't tell. And I'm sure part of what motivated Rav Kook was the same. If you just read it on the face of it, there's not actually anything about him being said. Just, okay, God, if you say okay, then how can I disagree? And then the Bnei Israel saying, okay, well, if Moshe and God say okay, how could we disagree? So Rav Kook tries to build in something more substantive, but I think it points to your question about what is that actual substance. Nothing clear about it in the Midrash itself and the Agadah itself. The sages dispute each other and present different approaches regarding the way in which a worthy communal leader need be selected. While Rabbi Yochanan adheres to divine choice, Rabbi Yitzchak suggests a different model of leadership of the people and by the people. According to this read by Rabbi Yitzchak, the human voice is enhanced in the choosing of Bezalel to become a leader. Moreover, there is a divine requirement for greater human involvement, and even an aspiration for a human stamp of approval. Okay, so Rabbi Yitzchak sort of adding this dimension, yes, okay, God has to play a role, but part of God's role is inviting the input and considering indispensable the attitude and the acceptance on the part of the people. Okay, now we come to this question of the source of Bezalel's wisdom or the meaning of his wisdom. Bezalel's wisdom, prophecy or craftsmanship. As the sugya continues, there is a third statement quoted that deals with the definition of Bezalel's wisdom. And we come back to the third. Rav Shmuel Bar Nachmani says in the name of Rabbi Yonatan, Bezalel al Shem Chachmato Nikra, Bezalel was called because of his wisdom. One can read this statement as a third and separate possibility regarding the reason behind his being elected for leadership, right? God chose, or the people, were consulted and approved, or his wisdom, his own quality, that specific quality. According to this statement, Bezalel represents a model of leadership that does not arise from divine choice and is not based on human election, but rather on personal merit. In modern terms, we might see Bezalel as a civil servant, not an elected official and not a man of the cloth. A civil servant who is appointed on the basis of his abilities, talents, and wisdom. And indeed, okay, Rav Moshe has anticipated what's coming up next. So great job in your comment in the chat. I'm not going to read it. I'll let people read if they want, and we'll come there in the text itself. So a civil servant who's appointed on the basis of his abilities, talents, and wisdom. And indeed, the sugya turns to demonstrate Bezalel's unique wisdom, right? So having said that he was named for his wisdom, now the Gemara goes on to explain, right? And there's a little play here. Let's just go back to the Sukkim for a minute, or one of the ones. Rei karati v'shem, I have singled out by name, Bezalel ben Uri ben Chor Bata Yehuda. So, Korei b'shem means kind of designate. but it also kind of means like named, right? So there's something when we say B'tzala al Shem Chochmato Nikra, right, it could mean he was called, he was appointed because of his wisdom, or he was named for his wisdom. And that play, on words is what we're going to see now in the continuation of the Gemara. So when God said to Moshe, "Go tell B'tzalel, make me a mishkan and an ark and vessels," Moshe went v'hafach and reversed the order and said to B'tzalel, "Make an ark and vessels," right, the interior furnishings, umishkan, and make the mishkan, which even though we colloquially refer to the entire structure and everything in it as the Mishkan really was the enclosure. That's the Mishkan. So, God told Moshe, "Go tell Batal to make me a Mishkan, the enclosure and everything in it." Moshe goes to Batal and says, "Make the stuff inside and then make the enclosure, the Mishkan." Batal said to him, "Moshe, our teacher, Min Hagosh Olam, the way of the world is that one first builds a house and then brings vessels into it. But you're saying, make me an ark and vessels and then a Mishkan, right? You told me put the furniture there and then build a house around it. That's not the way it's normally done. Where shall I put the vessels that I am to make? Can it be that the Blessed Holy One said to you, make a Mishkan, an ark and vessels?" Meaning, might it be that really what God said to you was first make the enclosure and then the contents, because that's what makes more sense? And Moshe says back to him, "Might it be?" Right? Just like he says, "Can it be?" Moshe asks back, sort of almost maybe playfully, maybe you're right, maybe. B'tzel el hayita, you were in the shadow of God, and therefore you knew. Like somehow you were in God's mind, or kind of God's reflection was cast upon you, or shadow was cast upon you as God was talking to me, and you weren't there, and so you knew, right? And again, lots to unpack. Why did Moshe switch it around? Was it a test? Did he just have his own opinion about this for his own reasons? And when Bezalel said it, Moshe acquiesced. But we see that Bezalel's approach is the same as God's approach. And now she's going to offer us two ways of understanding. One can understand this text in two different divergent and disputing ways. According to the first, Bezalel's greatness is expressed in the fact that he anticipated what was God's opinion, as a sort of prophet who exists in the shadows of the divine. B'tzel el, in the shadow of God. Bezalel understood what were in fact God's guiding wishes, right? That's sort of how Moshe reads it, that, it seems like you somehow, your mindset is aligned with God's, you intuit God's will, you somehow hear God's voice even when it's not directed to you. That's a kind of prophetic style, innate knowledge. But according to a different read of the same text, and I think this is just a lovely insight into this, Bezalel's greatness is manifest in his ability to think in a critical way about the guidelines set before him, right? Well, he doesn't say to Moshe, "Gosh, Moshe, it just feels like I kind of think God would mean this." No, he makes a logical argument, right? He responds in a logical and creative way to the guidelines that Moshe presented him with and chooses not to follow them. He says, "Listen, logic, wisdom, dictates that the normal way that this should be done should be different than what you're presenting to me." Right? That's something coming from his own insight and understanding as opposed to his intuiting God's word. These two divergent reads raise the question of whether Bezalel's greatness is embedded in his ability to be a kind of prophet or in his being a skilled artisan, and thus embedded in creativity that stems from logical and critical thinking. So just before we read the last paragraph, we just sort of summarize, going all the way back to the original Gemara. We had our kind of 3 points. One, God's self assigns the role of leaders, and therefore there's an absolutely indispensable divine influence, connection to the process of becoming a leader, versus the way she sort of set it up, the idea that, yes, even if God has a voice, part of God's voice is directed towards insisting on the role of other leaders and of the people in choosing their leader. And that's sort of the essential or necessary piece, is the voice of the community in indicating a leader. And then in the third, which we kind of originally said, well, this is just a third approach altogether, which is the meritocracy or the merit-based leadership approach. She now sort of split into the question of, well, what kind of wisdom? Is the wisdom that earns you leadership the wisdom of hearing God's voice, or is it the wisdom of the knowledge and insight that comes from what you have, which of course are God-given gifts, but they're cultivated in a way that's, after God gave them to you, are less about being connected to God and more about your own development. And this leads to her closing paragraph. Placing these disputes around a central character that appears at the end of the book of Shemot raises the notion that we have before us one further step in the process of moving away from Egyptian slavery and the social constructs that it requires. One more step away from a reality in which God is the only source of sovereignty, the one who chooses accordingly the leader of the people, just as God chose, for example, Moshe, the man of God and God's prophet. We can see in this a divinely inspired movement towards human election of leadership. Leadership whose power stems from critical and creative thinking, also when it comes across the divine voice. So, sort of the part of what it feels like she's arguing here is kind of the Chachamim loading these possibilities, the increased human voice, and even the reading of knowledge as being not exclusively about intuiting God's wishes, but about, applying our own reason and experience to situations. This is sort of loaded onto Bezalel particularly. Could be for a lot of reasons, but one of them is because he's coming in a moment when that transition is part of what God wants Bnei Israel to be going through. And of course, they're not, this is the end of the book of Shemot. It's still the beginning of the 40 years in the wilderness. They've got Moshe all the way through with them, but still we're sort of, adding on this additional element, Bezalel. And I saw at least one commentary that sort of suggested another reason for, adding all of these dimensions to Bezalel's character is simply because when he's introduced, God says, "Va'amaleo ruach Elohim," I filled him with a godly spirit, even though it then goes on to say, wisdom, insight, knowledge, and every craft. You can't call someone, you can't describe someone. This is the first person really since creation who's described in a way like this, of being filled with a godly spirit. And you can't sort of call someone that and not do more with it. So Bezalel is has to become a figure of something greater than just a craftsperson. In fact, going on forwards from here, Yehoshua is called a person of spirit. And so these sort of next generation post Moshe, also coexisting with Moshe, but next generation post Moshe leaders are somehow filled with a godly spirit, but that's still somewhat more distinct from God. God puts something into them, which they are then enjoined to use on their own. They don't, Moshe is the model of continuing to get communication from God. They are the model of people about whom we could say they had godly gifts, but they developed them on their own, and they sort of it's the human dimension which is being emphasized. And so Bezalel kind of serves as that model for this next stage in development of leadership and of humanity and of the nation. I saw Bracha already had a comment in the chat. Let's see. Great, Bracha, happy to hear another dimension, please.
Interesting that so many people focus on the Tzel El part. Maybe because my name begins with a bet, I'm more tuned into it. But there's something that fascinates me about the sense of being in the process, of not being detached from it, and that as a role model for how all of Bnei Israel need to be in connection with Hashem and the community and all that.
Beautiful. Yes. Yes. So like a bet as sort of being invested in the midst of, engaged with, kind of not set aside, right? We also remember that this is on not on the heels of, it's on both sides of this introduction to Betzalel is in Exodus, is in Shemot 31. We have our kind of next declaration of Betzalel, the one which is in our parasha, is in chapter 35, where it's where Moshe is telling Bnei Israel, "Ru'u kara Hashem b'shem Betzalel," and God filled him with Ruach Elokim. In between those, we have the model of Moshe in the end of last week's parsha, who pitches his tent outside the camp, wears a mask, when he's communicating with Bnei Israel, and only takes it off when he's with God. So Moshe is very much, isolated isn't exactly the right word, but a distant sort of figure. And Betzalel maybe has that much more, interactive, in the mix with quality that resonates very much. Thank you. Lance?
Established in 1906, Bezalel is proud to be recognized as Israel's preeminent academic institution for art, design, and architecture, pioneering originality, creativity, and innovation. And the notion that God fills Bezalel with wisdom implies that artistic ability is a divine gift, one that, when properly directed, serves a higher spiritual function. And it seems to me that what Bezalel represents is the idea that the Tanakh is really art, and it's a fiction, but it is divinely inspired. And God enables the artist, Bezalel, or whoever you decide wrote, whether it be Moses or the documentary apostles, well, however you look at it, all these people are contributing to a link between heaven and earth. And in fact, I would suggest even closer than that, an intertwining between heaven and earth. And actually, if you want to look at leadership, I would look at Joseph rather than Bezalel. I think the rabbis have really, I don't even know why they select Bezalel. I mean, there's plenty of governmental managerial stuff with Moses that you could spend your lifetime trying to think about that. But Bezalel is an artist. And the other thing is, what does the Mishkan represent? The Mishkan is an ark, a teva. It's the same exact thing that Noah had when he was rescued from the flood. And it's the same thing that carries the Israelites through the desert. It is, again, it is a hamakom. It is God's place.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. I will note that actually I'm sure there's much more than this, but in Rav Kook's comment on the first of the little passages here, about God declaring the Parnas and the proof texts about Betzalel, Rav Kook goes on to talk about Betzalel's quality, as a leader, and in particular the artistry that he does. And he writes here a beautiful passage about kind of the religious value of art. Yes, an archetype. Yes, about the religious value of art. And these are, from amongst the passages of Rav Kook that are often quoted in kind of the Jewish teachings about the religious value of art and the spiritual content of art, because art is, of course, very messy from a religious perspective, because we're always being told not to make images of various kinds and not to confuse, and the risks of drawing or sculpting the natural world as a kind of a slippery slope to idolatry. And yet, on the other hand, it's these expressions of human creativity and even depictions of God's world, which can be the most beautiful expressions of appreciation of God and of a religious or spiritual orientation. So I think the choice of the school name as Betzalel and Rav Kook, I think he has a famous letter upon the opening of Betzalel in which he writes a lot about the religious and spiritual value of art. So these things are all very much intertwined, interwoven with each other. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Well, I think as we encounter Bezalel again in these closing Parshiot, sort of think about what does his character mean to us again. I think as we when you come back to after with all this in the background, when you come back to the Psukim, there is scant, textual evidence to go on to build this case. Like the Bezalel again, he really does come out as as a really great, wise, divinely inspired artisan. Um, but all these additional layers very much are the kind of rabbinic add-on. So we can look for hints in the psukim as we read them in the next 2 weeks in vayakhel Pekudei, but mostly I think it's another level which is not obvious at all, but sort of gives us pause. I think she makes a good argument for the idea of this is the next dimension, next generation, next type of leader which Bnei Yisrael need. And so Bezalel sort of becomes the paragon or paradigm of that. Before we conclude, James messaged me, I had not seen this yet, that it seems like the ceasefire may be over, and that there's been a resumption at least of bombing in Gaza. And we'll take the opportunity just to say one chapter of Tehillim for the hostages that are there, for the Chayalim who are undoubtedly getting more and more involved, and for everybody who may find themselves in harm's way, and for strength for that which lies ahead. I'm gonna open up Tehillim 121. Feel free to respond after me with your audio on or off, either way. Shir למעלות תשאי על ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי. עזרי מעם אדוני, עושה שמיים וארץ. ייתן לעמוד רגליך, על ינום שומרך. לא ינום ולא יישן, שומר ישראל. אדוני שומרך, אדוני צילך על יד ימינך. יומם השמש לא יככה, וירח בלילה.
השמש לא יככה וירח בלילה.
ישמורך מקור רע, ישמור את נפשך.
אדוני ישמורך מכל רע, ישמור את נפשך.
אדוני ישמור צאתך ובואך מעתה ועד עולם.
אדוני ישמור צאתך ובואך מעתה ועד עולם.
חיינו כל בית ישראל הנתונים בצרה ושביה עומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה. המקום ירחם עליהם ויוציאים מצרה לרווחה, מאפלה לא רע משיבות לגאולה. השתה בעגלה בזמן קריב, ונאמר אמן.
Amen.
Each try to do whatever we can do in helping in the days ahead. And again, we'll be off next Monday night, but this will cover vayakhel Pekudei, and we'll pick up in 2 weeks with Vayikra and a new study partner. So looking forward to that. Take care, everybody. Good to learn together. Good to be together. Love to mom and dad. Good night to all.